Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. We are in Hosea chapter 2, beginning in verse 14. And we have a change of events beginning right here. I'll read through the first 13 verses. We covered them last week. What has taken place is Israel. We got Gomer and Israel taking place with Gomer and Hosea. But we also have Israel and the Lord. And as we get into these verses tonight, it's kind of focusing now on Israel. The application is really taking place. But nonetheless, chapter 2, verse 2, reading down to verse 13, seen from last week. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face, and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. That's probably referring to her dress, her makeup, her jewelry. That's attracting the lovers. This is Hosea to Gomer, talking to his children, trying to confront, to bring her back. Otherwise, I will strip her naked and make her as bare as on the day she was born. Referring to this, if she doesn't return, I'm going to take away all that I'm providing for her as her husband, both Hosea for Gomer or Yahweh for Israel. And I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. So again, if that's talking about Israel and the Lord and Israel, he's talking about the national identity, and all of the children, be the citizens, are not going to receive the favor. They're going to be the ones who suffer. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace. She said, and this would be what Gomer was thinking, I will go after my lovers, who give me my food and my water, my wool, my linen, my oil, and my drink. Just like Gomer was thinking, I don't need Hosea. It's these other guys that are providing for me. She's unfaithful to Hosea, thinking that these guys will continue to provide for her favors. Israel is thinking the Baals. They're very confused. Israel is very confused theologically. They've been inundated with the Baal culture. The Canaanites there to drive out have infiltrated, and they refer to the Yahweh, but Yahweh has become a Baal, and they really don't know which way is up. And so they're also giving credit to all their produce to the Baals. And so they're not afraid of Hosea's message, because not a problem. We're going to go after the Baals, and the Baals are providing for us. But the Lord says in verse 6, therefore, I will block her path with thorn bushes, her way to the Baals. I will wall her up so that she cannot find her way. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but will not be able to find them. Just like the New Testament talks about seeking, you'll find, knock, the door will be open. This is just the reverse. God's going to make sure. You think you've got a better plan. I'm going to guarantee and make sure that your plan does not work. Gomer may be thinking, I've got a better life with these other guys. It's not going to be better. Israel's thinking, I'm going to have a better life with the Baals. God says, I will make sure. Now, this is part of leading them to the wilderness. This is the conversation tonight, the wilderness. I'm going to make sure you hit the wilderness. Then, when she can't find them, both Gomer and Israel, then she will say, I will go back to my husband, as at first, for then I was better off than now. She has, in other words, she says, I'm going to go back to Hosea. And that's what's going to take place, chapter 3, verse 1. She's going to go back to Hosea. And same thing with Israel. Israel's going to realize when they get punished, Israel's going to be taken in dispersion. Eventually Judah will go. And remember, this is important for our conversation tonight. What takes place in 722, the destruction of Samaria and Israel going off into dispersion by the Assyrians, they have never recovered. So we're going to see tonight, there was the Exodus, and this is Exodus, and then they went into the wilderness. And we'll talk about this wilderness. And then they were in the land, and they drifted away and are going to be punished and sent to the wilderness again. That would be the Assyrian dispersion, but understand, they have not come back. They're still in this state today. Now we did have the Babylonian captivity, and the Babylonian exiles returned, and all the 12 tribes, remember all 12 tribes went to Babylon, because during this time of dispersion, when Israel was destroyed by Assyria, many of them fled into Judah. So they were there with the tribes, and they all came back. But that went back into the Roman dispersion, and they have not recovered from the Roman dispersion. There's Israelites scattered throughout history. There is a day eschatologically coming that I think, and I'm pretty sure, this chapter is referring to this return. Israel is still in this wilderness today. That's the way I'm approaching it. Nonetheless, we're looking at the chapter here. Then she'll say, I'll go back to my husband. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, the oil, who lavished on her the silver and the gold, which they used for Baal. So again, Hosea is saying Gomer doesn't even admit that I'm the one that's been providing for her. Or Israel is not acknowledging Yahweh. They think the Baals are providing for it, and what they get, the gold and the good things they get from the Lord, they use it to worship Baal and thank Baal for it. So God says we're done here. Therefore, verse 9, because they're not recognizing that I'm the one providing it and they're giving credit to the Baal, therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool, my linen, intended to cover her nakedness. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all of her appointed feasts. All that's coming to an end with the end of Israel. And again, Israel has mixed these together with Baal worship. And do notice they're very religious. This is a very religious people that's going into captivity. Or, excuse me, in being dispersed and being judged by Hosea's words here. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were her pay from her lovers. She says, this is what my lovers are giving me because I've gone to them. I'll make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. Again, notice the word Baals is plural. There is not just one Baal. There are many Baals from different cities, so they all have their own version of this. We'll talk more about that. She decked herself with rings and jewelry, ties back into the look of the prostitute, and went after her lovers, but she forgot. But me she forgot, declares the Lord. Now, suddenly we begin these new verses tonight with the word therefore. She has gone into the wilderness, a place where she's going to suffer, she's going to die of thirst. Her land has become a forest, which again, a forest. Again, we got to be careful with these words, because a forest, if we go to the forest, it's a vacation. We go out to the forest for vacation. We look at the trees. We maybe camp. I don't camp. I stay in a hotel. But it's a nice place to be. But the forest in this concept is a place where you're away from civilization. Oh, it sounds great. No, this is a place where wild animals roam. This is a dangerous place. People would go to the cities to get out of the wilderness. They'd go to the cities to avoid the chaos of the forest and the wild animals. In this case right here, the wilderness, the forest, is a very dangerous place to be. Now, that's where Israel's been taken, and the Lord now says in verse 14, therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. So there's a sudden change. One, he's angry, sending her to the wilderness. Now he says, I'm going to send her to the wilderness, and there I'm going to speak kindly to her, tenderly. I'm going to allure her. I'm going to try and attract her to me. Now, part of that attraction is, and then listen, this has already taken place here in the Exodus. It's taking place again, historical, beginning in 722 and continuing up until the Lord brings them in for the final time. Again, you can challenge my timing here, but this is definitely going to transpire in 722. They're definitely going to be dispersed. You do have the Babylonian captivity and the return, but you definitely have the Roman dispersion. And so this really hasn't been fulfilled totally. Not like what it's talking about here as we get into these verses. But this wilderness is going to have two parts. One is going to have the part of, I'm going to give you more references. the time of suffering, trying to survive on their own, find their way, and disaster after disaster, until finally they realize, just like Gomer did, they realize this is ridiculous. And the Lord is going to be standing right there ready in your place of suffering saying, are you ready? And He's going to lure them back to Him, and there's going to be a return. There's going to be a restoration. There's going to be the Lord welcoming them back. And that's what's taking place right here. He's not just shifting moods. One, He's upset and going to have them die in the wilderness. And then all of a sudden He says, well, when they get there, I'll be like, oh, it's okay. During that wilderness experience, it's going to be a time of testing, failure, and eventually He's going to bring them back. And that, if you remember this, it was the Exodus, the wilderness, and I've got a list here for us to look at, a series of tests and disasters of rebellion towards God. And He just left them there and kept pounding on them until finally they turned to Him, and that produced the Joshua generation. A generation that just marched right into the promised land. They were very strictly obedient, following God's commands after that wilderness experience. So in other words, it was the Exodus where God called them, they rebelled, and it produced the Joshua generation. The same thing's taking place here in a larger scale. They're in the wilderness. They're going to be brought out after they learn how to respond. It's going to be a glorious time. Now, I want to continue reading this. I'll speak tenderly to her in the desert. Verse 15, there I will give her back her vineyards. And when it says vineyards, it probably refers to everything. You know, the grain, the wine, all the things that He took away, the flax, the wool. And I will make the valley of Achor, we'll talk about that. That word means trouble, but it refers to Achan's sin, where they stoned him and piled stones on him. And so the valley of Achor, a door of hope. I mean, a huge reversal. The place where they stoned Achan and piled up stones is a place of trouble. That's going to become a door of hope, a complete turnaround. There she will sing, or the idea there is respond, as in the days of her youth. In other words, in this desperate situation of suffering in the wilderness, she's going to now be in such a need that she's going to respond. I mean, basically what I'm thinking Hosea is saying is God is going to make it so miserable for them and so empty and so hopeless that when He shows up and says, hey, you need a drink? They're going to be like, yes, we are looking for something. And I think that's where this is going. They're going to be so desperate that when He finally shows up and says, I'll give it to you again, and they're going to respond. And that's what it says. There she will sing, or respond, as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. And if you remember, when she came out of Egypt, Israel was not obedient. I mean, continually, and I'm going to show you that. So we got this concept here as we go through this wilderness experience. And I kind of stumbled on it earlier in the chapter. We were talking about how Israel was with God and then they fell away. Once they hit the wilderness, they instantly began to complain, murmur, you know the routine. They were never a glorious people. They couldn't be. They didn't have the capacity. They had come out of slavery. They did not yet know the Lord. And so as soon as He did something for them, they didn't understand it. Or as soon as they faced some kind of a test, they didn't trust Him. It took them a period of time to get to the place where they could learn about the Lord and trust Him. And then they would turn to Him. Verse 16, in that day declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. We're getting to this next week. You will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. That's the word Baal. And there are different words. We've got to go through all these words. Master, Baal, husband, Lord, owner. They're all the same thing in a context. But it's talking about relationship. It's going to go from being master or Lord to being on a personal basis husband. And that's what you'll call me my husband. You're going to know me. And it's all these things are repeated in Jeremiah and the other prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel. When we go through these, Hosea is one of the, we've already gone through Amos, Micah, Jonah, but Hosea is standing right there in that same time frame ahead of the prophets. Jeremiah is definitely going to be referring to these. In fact, I'll show you a couple things tonight. Jeremiah is going to definitely be familiar with this book and build on it. Isaiah the same way. If, like I've said before, if during this invasion of the Assyrians, Hosea is still alive, maybe living with Gomer, when they came in, Hosea likely fled to Judah. His book, nonetheless, his writings definitely ended up in Judah, and there's references to Judah in the book. And so, obviously, Jeremiah had access to the book of Hosea and builds on it. There's Isaiah and Hosea were contemporaries, so this book is repeated, and I don't want to say repeated like they're copying it, but they're building on the same ideas, the same Spirit of God and inspiration is taking place. But he's introducing some things here that will be repeated. Verse 17, I'll remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. Now this is, in this verse right here, we're talking about this time period right here. We have signs of it. You know, we got the church age, the period of grace. We've got people that are in maturity, reaching levels of being Christ-like. But as far as total fulfillment, we're waiting for that day to come. Same with Israel. Israel could come back. You're going to have some great Jews during the time. We got Nehemiah, you've got Ezra, but all of that is just early signs of a greater day that's going to come. And that's what we're talking about here, I believe. And we'll get into this next week. In that day, I will make a covenant for them. Well, I'll go back to verse 17. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day, I will make a covenant for them, for Israel, with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. And that sounds, again, just in going past this, very much like the early days of creation. You know, where he mentions all the animals and there's a covenant. Now they're going to be, in the earlier verses in this chapter, the beasts of the field were out there devouring their fields that had become forest. Now God says, okay, I'm going to make a new covenant. Now, not a new covenant, not the Jeremiah covenant in chapter 31, the new covenant we talk about. This is now a covenant of this restoration period with the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the creatures that move along the ground. In other words, they're not going to be threatening anymore. If you remember, that sounds very much like Isaiah lying down the age of peace. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land. Very much similar to talking about that age where the weapons are turned into farm equipment. So that all may lie down in safety. And you've got to think right there, that's so much like Isaiah's verses. I'll betroth you to me forever. I'll betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I'll betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord, or you will acknowledge, the word is Yahweh. In that day I'll respond, declares the Lord. I'll respond. Now, just like the word over here, they're responding where it says, in the NIV it says, there she will sing. They're responding. Now it's the Lord begins to respond. With their response, now the Lord responds, and he's going to respond to this. I will respond to the skies, and they'll respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine and oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. You know what Jezreel means? It means God sows. It's the place of sowing. We ended chapter 1 where God was bringing them out of the land. Again, out of the land, not out of captivity into Israel, but out of the land. They're going to grow up. Israel is going to grow up out of land. Probably, at least a very suggestive verse talking about the resurrection. They're going to appear again. And here it is again. They'll respond to Jezreel. I will plant her, Israel, my people, for myself in the land. I will show my love. And again, that planting them in the land, it can be bringing them back out of this dispersion. Or with Jezreel, the Lord sowing, it can be right back to that verse of resurrection. We're talking about the future state of the resurrection age. I will show my love to the one I called, not my loved one. I will say to those called, not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. And we'll get into those verses. So clearly, beginning in verse 14, he's talking about what happens in the wilderness and what takes place after that wilderness experience has been fulfilled. Now, the wilderness experience, we got some things I want to show here in the notes. And I think this is important to spend just, some time looking at it. I'm looking at the notes now, page 1. You've got the Hebrew up there. I had to kind of crunch it together and try to get it in one line. You got to read it from the right to the left. Therefore, behold, I will allure her and will bring her into the wilderness and speak to her comfort. So again, three things taking place there. She's in the wilderness where the Lord took her. He's alluring her, meaning that's like a lover. The notes for tonight are right there. Those right there. That's tonight's. It's not much. But three things. She's being taken to the wilderness where there's going to be, this wilderness is going to be a place, wilderness, is going to be a place, I'll just say suffering. And that is the point. It's going to be a place of suffering, of desperation. It always is. But in that state of suffering and desperation, they're going to need help. And that's where the Lord is going to come and say, I've got something you want, and He's going to lure. By causing her to suffer, He's going to set Himself up where He's going to get the attention. He's doing away with the Baals. He's doing away with all their misunderstandings, just erasing the slate and putting them back to a place where now, are you ready to learn again? Are you ready to see this? And when they say, we're ready, He says, okay, I'll have you in the wilderness. I will allure you. I will make myself attractive to you. Now, how does the Lord make Himself attractive? I mean, He's already attractive. He's already got all the glory. It's like He's not going to say, okay, well, let me try a better smile. Let me try a better look. He's already 100% perfection. So the only thing He can do, He can't change His hairstyle and, that looks good. The only thing He can do is on the other side. He's got to destroy what is here. He's already shining at 100%, but by taking them to the wilderness, their misconceptions of what they thought was good, the Baals, the false concepts, the false religion, all the worldly things, He's going to destroy all that. It's because there's nothing there anyhow in the eternal sense. But when all that's gone, now for the first time they're going to see the Lord. And so He's going to allure them not by making Himself more attractive, by changing something, but by ridding them of all their other options. So the only thing they can finally now see how beautiful the Lord really is. That's what's taking place in the wilderness. Now, I'm looking at the notes, page 1. Section 2 through 13, this is going to repeat a few things. Ended with the Lord taking away His blessings. He took away the grain, the wine, the wool, the flax in chapter 2, verse 9, that Israel had attributed to the Baals, or Gomer had trusted her lovers. And Israel was to be sent to the wilderness, chapter 2, verse 3, and the fields were to be turned into a forest after the beast had devoured the fields, leaving Israel utterly ruined. They're in the wilderness. The Lord put her there. Now in chapter 2, verse 14, this section begins with therefore. In other words, once I've got you in the wilderness, therefore, now we're ready to start over. Which means that these verses are the natural result of Israel being abandoned in the wilderness with a destroyed land. These things will result from Yahweh's second wilderness experience. I'm calling this, and again, not me, but is understood. This is the second wilderness experience. And in there's three things He's going to do. He's going to lure Israel. He's going to bring her into the wilderness, which she's already there, and speak tenderly to her. In other words, when she cries out for help here, there's nothing left, and she calls out. God is gracious. He's going to then speak tenderly. He's not going to say, I told you so. He's saying that now. I'm telling you, I'm going to put you back in the wilderness so you get a right perspective on life. I'm going to put you back in a desperate situation so you understand there's nothing here to be distracted by. You can't hear me? You can't understand? Okay, we're going to start erasing now. I'm going to put you in the wilderness. And now you get in the wilderness, now all of a sudden now you're in a place where it's there's nothing here. I'm looking. Right, can you see me now? It's can you hear me now? It's God saying, now can you see me? And once you say, yes, there's nothing else for me. Very good. Now He begins to speak tenderly. Now the alluring has taken place by getting her in the wilderness. Point 3. And this is, I should probably begin with, let me read this. Point 3. The wilderness is not to be understood as a poetic, reflective, solitude, romantic place. Kind of like we may say, we went to the forest. We went for a walk in the forest. It's that's kind of, if we went to some national park, we were walking the trails. Right, that's our culture. Their culture, if you're in the forest, you're probably going to get eaten by something. You're somebody's lunch. They're watching you and you don't even know it. You do not want to be in the forest. That's this setting right here. So we need to be careful. And some of the problems we have with this, again, it is a place of arid, life-threatening, abandoned, hopelessness, and a place of judgment. I'm going to go to Jeremiah chapter 2. And you can go there also. It's written down here later on. Jeremiah 2. Because, and this, earlier on, when I first started teaching this book, I tried one night, if you remember, we had a conversation. I was trying to build on this concept, and it didn't work. It didn't work like I thought it would. When I tried to teach, remember I taught, that Gomer was faithful, and then she must have fallen away, and then was brought back, just like Israel was faithful, and then fell away and was brought back. And we talked about it. It's like, the more I looked, and I went to look for the verses where Israel was faithful. And this is the verse I was looking for. Because it gives the impression that when Israel came, and it's not true. I mean, once you think about it, it's not, that when Israel came out of Egypt, they're like, okay, we're ready to go, Lord. And they are the faithful wife. They did not become the faithful wife until after the suffering. They did after the 40 years. They were not the faithful wife after the 10 plagues. Oh, they're ready to leave slavery. But right away, they didn't understand anything. They were murmuring, they were complaining. We'll look at a list here. But Jeremiah's got this verse right here, chapter 2, I'll begin in verse 1, but it actually begins in verse 2. And this is the verse I knew was there, and there's a couple like it, that I tripped on because I misunderstood the concept. I was thinking, well, here it is. It says, the word of the Lord came to me, Jeremiah says. And this would be the year 627. I've got that written down here if you put this in sequence. And that's kind of an estimate, a speculation. Go proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem. Quote, I remember the devotion of your youth. Now this is the Lord speaking to the people of Jeremiah's day. I remember the devotion of your youth, how as a bride you loved me, and followed me through the desert, through that land not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. All who devoured her were held guilty, and disaster overtook them, declares the Lord. Hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, all you clans of the house of Israel. Again, talking to both groups, because they're both now what's remaining, the northern Israel's mixed in with Judah. This is what the Lord says. What fault did your fathers find in me that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. That's a key line right there. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. You're going to check out of reality, create your own alternative lifestyle or alternative reality. You're going to become unreal. You're going to become worthless. It's not going to be productive. And goes on and starts talking about this. And again, we can come back to this later. But notice right there, the devotion of your youth, as a bride you loved me, followed me through the wilderness. And that gives the impression that when in the Exodus during this 40 years, they're just following the Lord, being obedient like a bride and her husband. They've come together, and that gives the impression the wilderness is this great, like, romantic place you go for your honeymoon. You just go to the wilderness, and you're alone, and you look into each other's eyes, and you're just reflective on how good life is. But wait, that's what it appears. But you go back to the notes now, please. That's not what happened in the wilderness, and we know this. That's going to be the end of the wilderness. That's what the wilderness did. They went out there not understanding, but through a process of time, they came to trust the Lord. They became the bride. They were ready to be the Joshua generation. But for 40 years, well, here it is. Look on page 1. I'll go to point 3a. Just because the wilderness in Numbers produced the Joshua generation does not make the 40 years in the wilderness a great time of obedience and bonding with the Lord. It wasn't their honeymoon. It was more of a time of training, of discipline, of testing and failure until they got to a place where they were desperate. Then they finally turned to the Lord. The Lord said, okay, we're ready now, right? Point B, the 40 years of wilderness with Moses was a time of continual rebellion and failure by Israel, including their time at Baal Peor. We know about that. Numbers 14, 20 through 23. This is the Lord speaking in chapter 14, verse 20 through 23, and we could go there and look at it. I just put it right here. Then the Lord said, and he's talking to Moses. This is the Lord speaking with his bride in the wilderness. He's ready to torch the bride. He's ready to just get rid of them. I've had enough. Even tells Moses one time at Mount Sinai, he says, I'll just destroy him. We'll start over with you. And then Moses interceded and said, wait. Remember the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can't start over with me. You've got to work with what you got. And the covenant. Again, not like God forgot it. But here's what the Lord says to Moses, point C, Numbers 14:20. I have pardoned, because he pardoned them because Moses prayed for him, according to your word. But truly, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with with the glory of the Lord. In other words, it's not filled with his glory yet. It's going to be. We're heading there where the earth is going to manifest his full glory. He says, I have pardoned them according to your word. But truly, as I live, the Lord's saying, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times. I was testing them, and they turned and ran a test on me. He says, none of these that have done these 4, notice he uses the term 10 times. The Lord says, they've done this to me 10 times. I was testing them, and they turn it and test me and tell me what to do. None of the men that have been here and seen these things, that have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give their fathers. I'm fulfilling a promise I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now it's time to go into the land. But these 10 times, this generation has refused to listen. Now I'm making a promise. They're not going to be the generation. We're going to continue training through their lifetime and get the next generation, the Joshua generation. And none of those who despise me shall see it, see the promised land. Now I've got listed right here, this could be those 10 times. And this is that wilderness. This is the Lord during that wilderness experience saying, these are not the people. I'm going to wait for another generation. And you know all these things. Exodus 14, at the Red Sea, where it seemed that Pharaoh's army would destroy them. They're like, what's going on? You betrayed us. And Moses parted the sea. At Marah, where they found bitter water, and they complained. They argued with the Lord. The desert of Sin, as they got hungry, and they went, why don't we have any food? And God provided manna. They paid no attention to Moses concerning the storing of the manna. And he says, just take what you need. God will provide more tomorrow. And they started hiding it in their refrigerators. And they didn't have refrigerators. Exodus 16, in the desert of Sin, as they disregarded Moses concerning, Exodus 17, at the Raphidim, as they complained for water. At Mount Sinai, as Aaron led the people in making the golden calf, then the people were raged against the Lord. You got snakes appearing. And then you got the grumbling, provoked, the complaining about we got all this manna. They're tired of manna. God's providing manna. They go, we never get any meat. Where's the good stuff? And so then brings in quail. They got sick. Then at Kadesh in the desert, when the people refused to go into the land. Now that was just the first 2 years of being in the wilderness. So those first 2 years were not a honeymoon experience. They were in the wilderness going through it, and God was trying to show them, I'm going to take you to the... Now God could have figured out going around the Red Sea, but he takes them right up to the Red Sea. Got this? We're stuck. Well, he just did 10 signs, 10 plagues on Egypt. I'm sure there's something going to happen, or something. We don't know. But they didn't. They got mad. They complained. And all the way through those first 2 years, they saw, they had enough evidence. And one thing this teaches us, and we've talked about it before, it teaches that seeing miracles and seeing signs and seeing God do things does not produce faith. The Bible doesn't teach that. If you see enough miracles, if you see enough signs, if God would just write his name in the sky, everyone would say, my gosh, there is a God. That won't work, because these guys saw the 10 plagues. They saw the parting of the Red Sea, and they continued for 10 more problems, and God answered them, and they did not know the Lord. You don't get to know the Lord by seeing some manifestation or him answering a prayer. You know the Lord by knowing the Word, of knowing his character. You get to know him by him revealing himself to you, and that's going to take this period of 40 years. And this generation, they saw everything. It wasn't good enough. And so this wilderness is going to put them in a position, this 40 years, where after 40 years of going through these, they've learned And they've got Moses, and understand, Moses was teaching them. Moses was teaching constantly, explaining. He was writing, Joshua was writing, they're putting these things together. And that's what the Deuteronomy is a collection of his final teaching, of teaching that Joshua generation. These are the things that happened. This is what we've learned. And this generation was ready, and they knew the Lord. They even faced some tests. They rose up, met the test. They didn't murmur, they didn't complain. They just says, all right, let's do this. And so they were ready. That came out of this wilderness experience. In the book tonight, Hosea, as last week we saw, was saying, God is going to send them to the wilderness. I'm going to take everything away that I gave them. Not because I'm that kind of a God, but they don't understand where they're coming. They think the Baals have given them these things. So they're going to continue to look to the Baals. They're going to continue to look to their own misconceptions for all of their answers. And meanwhile, God's over saying, hey, look at me, look at me. They can't see the glorious God because they're seeing all this junk and giving all the blessing that God's given credit to the Baals. So God says, okay, I'm going to take you to the wilderness. You're going to forget about the Baals. You're going to be hopeless. And in that hopeless state, I'm going to arrive. I'm going to lure you. You're going to see me. And when you cry for help, I will speak tenderly to you. Now, this is not talking about, I do not think this is talking about something that took place sometime after 722. I don't think this is fully taken place yet. We can make application to the church with Jesus Christ fulfilling the covenant, coming and paying for sins, and all the Gentiles hearing, the church starting. This is talking about Israel specifically growing in the land and having everything restored to them. And now, I'm going to finish reading these notes and show you a few more things. Go to page 2 of the notes. Oh, I don't have anything really left here. It just says, point D, the wilderness was a time of testing, failure, learning, testing, failure, learning, until Israel learned to trust God. Then I've got that verse in Jeremiah, verse we just read, where it talks about, again, how nice it was, the bride, how they followed the Lord. Now, you understand, we just read a verse, they're not following the Lord, and in fact, God's saying, get rid of them. If it wasn't for Moses interceding, they may not have made it through the wilderness, if you want to accept it at face value. I want to do this real quickly, and just, you can see throughout, go to Revelation, throughout, and I don't want to turn this into an eschatological event, but at some point, if we make this connection, we're looking at, I'm looking in chapter 12. And you know the routine, how this works. Chapter 12, but I also want to look at chapter 7. But let's go to chapter 12 first. And without getting into the whole, I don't want to get too far into this, but the day is coming, and we're going to have the 70th week. You're going to have a halfway point where the Antichrist is going to set himself up. Israel is going to be very positive, and this is important. Israel, again, there are Jews that have come to Christ and are part of the body of Christ. There are, we know that because Paul, Peter, these were Jews. The Christianity started with the Jews. But there is Israel who's still holding to the old covenant, rejecting Jesus Christ, and they're waiting, and we know they are, and they're waiting for a great political leader. They're waiting for someone to arise. And again, I've said this before. I know I've talked to even over in Israel at the Western Wall, at a couple stores and shops right there, asking about what is this going to look like. And they think there's going to be a man from the line of David. Now realize, in just a general sense, Israel as a whole is not, they're not necessarily looking for an afterlife. Christians, our problem sometimes is we go with we talked about, we go into the Greek thinking, the Hollywood idea that we die and go off into heaven, and then we live there forever in heaven, forgetting that there's the earth that God is coming back to restore and set up a kingdom. And so we sometimes go to heaven and we're out of here. The Jews, in a general sense, can easily forget about heaven. They're not even convinced there's an afterlife. It's all this world. And so I'm looking for a deliverer from heaven that's going to come either at my death or somewhere, and he's going to take me and put me with him in this spiritual kingdom. Again, I believe there's going to be a physical manifestation also. The Jews are looking for some kind of a physical, political leader from the line of David, and he's going to become a great leader that's going to give them and bring them into the land. And as I was talking to different Jews over in Israel, I didn't say anything, but as they're describing this political leader they're waiting for, to give them the land, to let them rebuild the temple, put them back on the Temple Mount. I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, you're describing the Antichrist. I mean, they're not talking about Jesus. They're talking about a natural man that's going to come up and solve the world problems and give them their rightful place. And if you know this story in the Bible, that is exactly what the Antichrist is going to do. They're going to get the land. They're going to get the temple. It's going to be rebuilt. And they are enjoying this first, if we want to say, first 3.5 years. It's like they know they found the Messiah. Jesus told them. He says, I come with testimony from Moses, from the scripture, from the signs, from my Father's voice. I've got testimony. He says, and you won't believe me. Yet someone's going to come in their own name and simply tell you, I am he, and you will accept it. They rejected Jesus Christ, the whole Old Testament, and Jesus told them. He gave them example after example. He says, and you'll reject it because you don't want to. But yet someone's going to come, and he's not talking about, well, who could that be? It's the Antichrist. He's going to come without scriptural testimony, without the word from God, and just say, I'm him. And he's going to match what their false concept is, and they're going to agree, and they're going to give it all to him. And it's going to be a great 3.5 years. At that point, it's going to be the ultimate revealing of Baal. The Antichrist is going to come, set himself up on the Temple Mount, as you know. And the Jews are going to, Jesus tells them, when you see this happen, when you see him sitting on the holy place, you know it's time to run, because the greatest disaster is coming. Now he's saying this 2 times. In one case, he's saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, look up because deliverance is coming. Another time he says, when you see the Jerusalem surrounded, it's time to run. They ran. The Christians knew this, and so in 66, 67 AD, the Christians left and went across the Jordan up to Decapolis and set up a Christian community and came back after the Jewish wars. The Jews stood there and fought. They thought they had another guy that they chose to be the Messiah, and they thought they're going to be delivered, but they didn't. But nonetheless, when this happens here, they're going to flee, and they're supposed to flee to the wilderness. We can see this. Daniel says, when you see this, flee to the mountains of Moab, Ammon, and Edom. Jesus says, when you see this, flee to the mountains. And then we're going to see here, they're going to go to the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they're going to be cut off. They're going to have to survive. And it is from this place right here, they're going to meet the true Messiah. And what they started off with right here, accepting this wilderness experience is going to quench them. They're going to realize that was a stupid idea. What they're waiting for, they're going to get it, and they're going to realize after 3.5 years, this is the dumbest idea we've ever had. Because they're out here. Now, again, I'll throw this out here, and we've talked about it. If you believe in the pre-trib rapture, the church goes up here, and we miss all of this. That's fine if you want to hold to it. I taught that for years. The last book that we talked about this, went through extensively. I think the church is going to go through here because it's during this time there's great persecution, not against Israel. Israel's in league with the Antichrist. Everything's fine. But there's going to be persecution against believers at this time. Crazy persecution. The martyrs under the throne are going to just pile up in heaven. And it's the greatest persecution we've talked about that. And then when Jesus, the sign of the Son of Man, appears on the throne, the world sees it. They run and hide. It says, him who sits on the throne, they say, hide us from him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. The wrath, the trumpets and the bowls begin here. And at that point, if we go to chapter 7, you're going to have two things take place. It is at that time, there's a great deliverance, the rapture. You disagree with that? I understand, because I just made the transition in 2012. Because this makes more sense. We meet the Lord in the air because when He appears, He's not leaving. We meet Him in the air, not to go away with Him. We meet Him in the air because His next stop is earth. He appears and we're escorted back. Just like Paul was met by the church and escorted into Rome. We've talked about this. But, that's decided. The issue tonight is at this point, the Jews, their Messiah appears just like they've been waiting for in the Old Testament, but they gave up on it and started looking for a political leader. Now, the sign of the Son of Man appears in the heavens and the church goes. And Jews are like, whoa. And that's where in chapter 7, 144,000 are sealed and sent to the wilderness because they are not believers. And during that 3.5-year period, they're going to be protected, but they're going to have realized, and they're going to mourn, Zechariah, mourn for him like the one they pierced, like they mourn for their only lost son. And they're going to realize we've rejected the Messiah, and thus all Israel will be saved. And they're going to then, when He returns, there's going to be a series of events take place. They're going to meet Him on Mount Zion here in Jerusalem, if we read this. But there's another wilderness experience. I believe that wilderness experience, in a sense, began in 722, and Israel has been struggling this whole time, and it's not until here that they're going to have the final days of this wilderness experience. I'm going to read chapter 12 very quickly. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed in the sun with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain and was about to give birth. And again, that would probably be referring to Israel. And the promise was the word, the truth is coming through Israel. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and the 10 horns and 7 crowns. Those are all the kingdoms of the empires from Egypt through Assyria to Greece and Babylon, all the way to the Antichrist kingdom. And it's Satan using the world powers to come against Israel. His tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman, which again I'm saying is Israel in a sense, who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child. And that child, that giving birth, can be to the promises of God, to the Word of God, to all things, but ultimately to the Son of God, who was the Word in flesh, the promise in flesh, was about to give birth to a child so that he might devour her child the moment it was born, because he knows the seed of the woman's going to crush his head, and he's got to get rid of that seed as soon as he can. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all nations with an iron scepter. So clearly that's Jesus Christ. And the woman is Israel. You can say it's Mary, but that's kind of, Mary was the focal point or the pinpoint of Israel giving birth to the Messiah. Anyway, and her child was snatched up to heaven. That's your word, harpazo, raptured. Snatched up to heaven, to God, and to His throne. The woman fled into the desert. Here it is. The woman who is Israel, who gave birth to the child, who brought deliverance and was taken to heaven, but the woman is still left on the earth. She fled into the desert, that's the wilderness, to a place prepared for her where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days, that's 3.5 years. And there was war in heaven, talks about all these things. Then verse 13, then the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth. He pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given to the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. That's 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman. So she's under serious attack in this wilderness. Now remember, the Lord has already appeared. The nations have fled and now they're regrouping together. The church, it's either the church has gone up here or the church, the believers, have gone up here. But Israel's still down here in the wilderness now, right after 3.5 years of glory. Yeah, we're back on the Temple Mount where a deliverer has come. Now their deliverer betrays them. The Baal betrays them, and now they're back in the wilderness knowing this was him. We missed it. And now they're out here being protected, learning all of these things, learning to walk with him, trust him. And ultimately it goes through verse 17, then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commands and hold the testimony, and talks more about that. And ultimately, if you look over into, chapter 14, then I looked, chapter 14, verse 1, and I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, that would be Jesus, remember the wrath of the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion with him, 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. Now, this right here, if Mount Zion, you can make that heaven if you want to. They're raptured up to heaven also. But you see, the Old Testament doesn't support that. The Old Testament supports them meeting the Lord in Jerusalem, that they're going to join him in battles here in the earth. They're still here, ready to inherit the kingdom on the earth. So again, I put that as a physical thing with him, 144,000 who had his name on Mount Zion. And I heard a sound from heaven. Notice right here, verse 2, I heard a sound from heaven, which means they're not in heaven. They're with him on Mount Zion. If Mount Zion is heaven, they're with him. Then you heard a sound from heaven. You can do it, play it however you want to. I mean, not however you want to, but there's different ways of putting it together. Obviously, it's eschatology. It goes through and talks about all these things. Anyway, my point from Hosea, go back to Hosea. This wilderness experience that Hosea is referring, God is upset with Israel in 739, 740, right at this time period. That's where these things are being spoken by Hosea. And it's going to begin to take place with the killing of the fifth generation after 6 months of Jeroboam's or Jehu's reign. And then Israel's going to fall in 722, and they are going to be dispersed, and there's never going to be a rebuilding, a reconstruction of the nation. They're not going to get the land. They're going to come back for a while from Babylon captivity, just to have continuous problems with the Seleucids, the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then they're dispersed again into the nations. I mean, driven from the land. And they've been there since this time, and ultimately from this time in 70 AD, if you want to call it that, they've been dispersed, waiting for these verses to be fulfilled. And I think that wilderness experience, they're in it now, but there's going to be the ultimate fulfillment of that wilderness experience we saw in Revelation. And that's going to lead to, let's go back to Hosea chapter 2, verse 14. And we got to finish this next week because I want to tie this into Isaiah and Jeremiah, some other chapters. Chapter 2, verse 14. Therefore, I'm now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert. Since they've rejected God, I'm taking them to the desert. And that's 722 BC. And they're going to be here for a long period of time. They're going to be allured. They're going to be such a situation that they're going to have all these ideas. I got to work all this stuff out of them. They're going to end up rejecting the Lord Jesus Christ as a nation. But he says, when they get there, I will speak tentatively to her. There I will give her back her vineyards. I will make the valley of Achor, the valley of trouble where Achan was stoned. That's the last thing we've got on page 2. A door of hope. What was a place of destruction? Let's read this right here on bottom of page 2. Valley of Achor is a rugged, narrow entrance into the central hill country coming up from the Jordan Valley, which runs through Jericho up to Ai and to Bethel. And here we're doing this on Monday nights with Joshua very slowly. But here's the camp over here. Here's Jericho. Here's Gilgal. Ai, say right up in here, and then Bethel up in the hill country. And it climbs. And in Jericho, this is the Jordan Rift. It's very low here, very straight, as far as flat. But then it starts, and Jericho's just right there. You can see the Jordan River from Jericho. But from here, it begins to rise. I mean, we've been in a couple of buses at different times we've been there. And when you're coming down, you just feel yourself just winding down from Jerusalem. Just winding down. When you start climbing, the bus, like, driving up from Jericho up to Jerusalem. It hits the ridge right through here, then tapers down into the foothills, into the lowlands, and then you got the Mediterranean Sea and the coastal plain right here. So this is a climb up and then a climb down. When they went to Jericho, they came across the Jordan and came up to Jericho. Jericho fell. They went back to Gilgal, Israelites, and then they're going to now go over to Ai and attack Ai. They sent some spies, you know the story. It's not too much trouble. We won't have any trouble doing it. But what had happened was Achan, one of the Israelites, instead of giving up, it was supposed to be a total burning, a total dedication of Jericho to the Lord. Don't take anything. I'm giving you the whole land, but don't take anything from Jericho. Just burn the whole thing. Achan saw a couple things, a robe, a couple bars of gold, and decides, just take this quick, no one can see it, and put it in his tent. When we went to Ai, the Lord was upset because someone sinned in the camp. And they did the lot testing and found out it was from this tribe, from this family, from this clan, this family. And then Achan, do you want to tell us anything? He says, and he did. He took these things. And so they took him to, well, the place of Achan. They took him into one of these narrow passes, probably where, you know, you're walking and going through the ridges, where they put him somewhere and they stoned him to death. And when they stone someone, they don't just chase him around throwing stones at him. You put him somewhere in some kind of a pit, some kind of a hole, some kind of a place where they can't get away. I know, it sounds ridiculous to Americans. And they threw stones at him and then covered him up. And it was a place of trouble. Joshua says you can see it yet today. At the book of Joshua, it says you can still see that place today. We talked about that last night. Well, that was, again, a very terrible time, a very great disaster, a horrible way to die. But Hosea says, reading from the English Standard Version on page 2 of the notes, and there I will give her vineyards in the wilderness after the wilderness experience is over, and make the valley of Achor, which means the valley of trouble, is what it was called, the valley of Achan, the valley of trouble, will make the valley of trouble a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth. Notice that, of her youth. Now, what does that sound like? She will answer now as in the days of her youth. That sounds just like Jeremiah chapter 2. When she was young, when she was a bride, when we were in the wilderness together. There now, at this point, when you get to this point, it'll be just like the Joshua generation. You're now ready. We're like on our honeymoon finally after 40 years in the wilderness, or 2.5 millenniums in the wilderness. They will be ready. And this place of judgment will become a place of hope. It says, there it will be like in the days of her youth, as the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. And do not be deceived. I mean, this right here, probably, I don't want to say Jeremiah did have any original thoughts. But remember, Hosea was written first, and then 100 years later, roughly, Jeremiah is on the scene. And when Jeremiah writes chapter 2, verse 2, and talks about her being in the wilderness and following the Lord, this may be where he gets the idea. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth. What youth? As at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. And we know when Israel came out of the land of Egypt, she was not obedient. She was not a good bride. In fact, the Lord wanted on a couple occasions just to destroy them and start over. But through that period of being in the wilderness, they became the bride. They learned about the Lord. They learned to be obedient. And now they had a great time. In other words, there's a day coming where even this time of trouble right here is going to become the door of hope. Now, one more thing. I've got it written down here. So yeah, point C. Several commentators make this connection. The Hebrew word, you know what a homonym is. A homonym. I've got it, point C in there right there, a homonym. It's two words. You've got two different words, and they're likely from two different languages. They've come together in your language. One comes from, the Latin, and one comes from the Anglo-Saxon language. And yet they're two different words, and they mean two different things from two different languages, but they're spelled the same and they're pronounced the same. And the word hope that is used here is a homonym for the same word that means cord or rope that is used, and again, I've not had time to go through and develop this, and it may be nothing. It may be nothing. It's just that it's there. This is in the Hebrew, this word is pronounced the same way as this word. It's spelled the same way, but this is coming from one language, this is coming from another language. They're two different words. They're not connected at all. They just happen to sound the same and be spelled the same. And this word right here, cord, is the word that is used for the rope that Rahab put out of her window. The scarlet thread, the scarlet rope that she put out. She put this, and it's pronounced the same way, that hope. And so, just like the commentators, as they put this together, just like Achan, the place of trouble becomes the place of the cord. So instead of at Jericho, a switch was made. At Jericho, Achan was the Jew. He was the one who was going to inherit the promised land. But he stole from Jericho, and he ended up the place of trouble. But Rahab heard the spies, and she says, I believe your Lord. I believe, what can I do? And they says, you put a rope out of the window, and we will spare you and anyone in your house. So she got her family together, put the rope out, and Achan ends up getting stoned. A Jew ends up getting stoned because he didn't obey, and Rahab, a Canaanite, ends up joining him. And as we read last night, her place in the land was still there to the day of the writing. She was still alive when the book was being read. She's still living right down there, right down the street, right here. Her family is right around the neighborhood there. It's Rahab's place. And so they think, and Hosea does it throughout the book, plays on words. And instead of the place of trouble, it's going to become the place of hope, which is the same word if you look at it. It's the same word. Does he mean hope or does he mean cord? The place of the cord. Well, no, he means the hope. It's like, and so he's messing with the Jews, or the Israelites and their language possibly in that reference right there. Again, not a slam dunk. It's there. It may be just a coincidence, but it kind of plays out kind of nice that the place of trouble where Achan was stoned for disobeying is going to actually become the place of deliverance from the place that was judged. In other words, I'm going to bring you back. So it's all coming back to God bringing deliverance to Israel. I want to go some more of those verses next week and look at some connections with the other prophets and move on through it. So I'll pray. You're free to go. Thank you for being here. Father, we thank you again for the chance to look into your word. We thank you for the hope that we have in you, that you've provided us deliverance through Jesus Christ. We ask that we would avoid being distracted and caught up in things of the world, that we cannot see your glory, that we look away from your beauty to see the beauty of the world. We ask that we would discipline ourselves and your Spirit would continue to lead and guide us, that we may see who you are and what you are doing in our lives, that we may make a faithful representation and witness to you at this time in history. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you for your time.